everyone wants to know how much countries are investing, right? So the most used indicator for that is the intensity ratio. So this is just basically relating your investment in R&D, the R&D investment in the expenditure in the country, compared to the value of agricultural production, right? So that supposedly will give us an idea of how intensive is investment in each country, and we can compare countries of different sizes, right? Because we cannot compare in absolute values expenditure of India and Nepal, for instance. So we need to use these indicators like ratios to compare. So basically, this index that we are proposing here comes from finding that the intensity ratio is not an adequate measure to compare countries in terms of R&D intensity. So let me try to convince you of that. So this is what I will, for instance, this is an example with just arbitrary selected countries. And this is what I was trying to make sense of. And so I started looking at the intensity ratio of these countries. As you can see there, well, there's some expected things. You know, we always hear that developed countries invest more. Intensity ratios in developed countries is higher, 2%, 3%, 4%. You see there, Japan is very high. On the other hand, well, developing countries show clearly lower ratios, intensity ratios. But then when you start comparing and looking in more detail of those different countries, you start finding weird things. For instance, we know, as a fact, it's not by my own idea, that for instance, China, India, Brazil have the most developed research systems among developing countries, right? So they should be doing something. They should be investing, right? If that's the case. So my first question was, why the heck are these countries appearing at the right end of the graph? And so should we conclude that, for instance, Botswana has a much developed research system than India or China or Brazil? Botswana is even higher than Germany and France and the United States, the intensity ratio. And on the other hand, if Brazil, India, and China are the most developed systems, why on earth Brazil has 2% intensity ratio? Is that much more developed than China and India? Why is India only 0.3% or China 0.6%? Well, looking at some literature and looking on different sources, what I found is there's a lot of discussion about these issues. And the problem is that the intensity of investment in a country depends on a lot of factors. It's not only, let's put it this way, investment is not necessarily proportional to the size of agriculture. So depends on a lot of other things. For instance, depends on structural variables that are not controlled by policymakers, right? So it's not that if you want, you can reach 1%. It doesn't work like that. There are other things that are affecting this, the level of your intensity ratio that you can reach. So, for instance, the income of the country, the size of the economy, and the size of the agricultural sectors are factors that we found are related to the intensity that you can reach. So, for instance, it's not, you can imagine why, let's say, high-income countries can invest more, can have higher intensity ratio, because, well, institutions there are well better, the returns, these countries, the governments are able to mobilize public resources in a more efficient way, et cetera, et cetera. So those countries will naturally will find easier to invest, while other countries with less developed institutions and other problems, will find less returns to even R&D investment. So the problems that we were seeing in the figure that I showed you before are related to the effect of these variables, right? And the effect of this variable in investment is not linear. So it depends on the combination of these three variables, the income of the country, the size of the economy, the size of the agricultural sector, what you end up with. And this is why I was arguing that the intensity ratio is a very misleading measure of intensity that cannot be used to determine intensity gap or individual countries, for individual countries, or make policy recommendations. So what we did was try to use this knowledge that I just showed you in terms of what affects the investment capacity of a country, and develop a new index that combines three, let's say it's a combination of three different indices. So it includes the usual one, the intensity ratio, the classical intensity ratio, R&D expenditure divided by agricultural GDP, but it also includes R&D expenditure divided by the whole size of the economy, and it includes also R&D expenditure as a ratio of income per GDP per capita, or income, average income of the country. So the actual level of R&D expenditure will depend on the level and the particular mix of these three indices in each country. And countries with similar values of the three indices should show similar levels of R&D intensity. If we have two countries with similar levels of these three indices, then if we have two countries with similar proportions of these three indices, then the difference in intensity that we'll find between those countries are really difference in these countries are comparable, and the difference in intensity are, we can say, are real differences, not rather than the ones that we observe in the intensity ratio. So what can we do with the ASTI index? Well, that was the whole point of developing this. We argue that using the ASTI index, you can rank and compare countries according to R&D intensity levels. You can identify underinvesting countries comparing intensity levels of countries with similar characteristics. That is, our conclusions are based in comparisons, right? When we say this country has a low level of intensity using the ASTI index, is relative to similar countries in terms of these three components of the index. And then we can also determine intensity gaps and define specific investment targets for different countries and regions. So let me show you how it works. So I mentioned before that the ASTI intensity index uses three indices, right? So here I will only use two just for the sake of the presentation, right? I will not deal with the 3 dimensions. But imagine that it's only two in this case, and so you will get a sense of how it works. So let's say that those are three countries, and you can think of country A as being the US, let's say, country C being India, and country B being some other country, let's say, I don't know, any other country. So if you, of course, you see that the coordinates of the countries are the two intensity index. One is on the vertical axis, you have the traditional intensity ratio. On the horizontal axis, it's the R&D related to income. These are two of the indices that we are using, right? So this is what you get. This is an explanation, for instance, why India is so low. So if you compare the US with India, country A and country C, of course, the US has higher intensity ratio. There's no way that India can get closer to that. But when you start adding dimensions to the problem, then the situation changes completely. So if we consider two indices, we are considering the ASTI index, which are the countries that have the highest intensity in this figure? Because if we use one dimension, it's clearly country A. If we use two, then the thing changes completely. We can say first that country B is less intensive than the other two. Why? Because it has lower values in both indices. It's dominated by the other two countries, right? But when we compare A and C, we cannot say that because A has a much higher R&D per agriculture GDP, but has a lower indicator in R&D per income. So those two countries are, you cannot say that A is investing more than C or C is investing more than A. It's just that you have different dimensions and they have different combinations of the two indices. Both countries are investing, let's say, at the same level. None of them is dominating the other, in terms of intensity, of course. And that's what I was saying. We get our analysis from the comparison of countries. So we compare all the countries. Let's see, here we have 3, but let's say we have 80, 100 countries, and we compare them in this way, in the space, and then we can find which countries are defining the frontier. Those are the countries that are investing at the highest intensity, okay? And then the countries inside that frontier are the ones that are investing a lower intensity than the ones at the frontier. So, for instance, there country B clearly, falls within the range, and so we can say that country B is investing less intensity than country A and C. And that's important, to keep in mind that all of this is relative to other countries. We use comparisons to determine our highest investing countries and the countries that are investing less intensively. So for instance, if we want to determine how do we determine the investment gap for country B? So country B is investing less than A and C, as we said. So what we do, the question is, how much less is country B investing? And how much that country can invest potentially? So we compare country B with a country with a similar proportion of the two indices that we are using. So if you can see there, country B is in the same ray from the origin than country C, which means that both countries have the same proportion of the two indicators. So the comparison to see how much country B can potentially invest is with country C, which is a similar country in terms of the combination of indicators. And so what is the investment gap in this approach when we use these comparisons? Well, that is the investment gap. The distance that country, the distance from country B to the frontier in terms of intensity. So we can say potentially country B could be investing as much as country C because it has a very similar composition of the indices. That is similar income related to R&D, similar R&D related to GDP. This figure is comparing the ASTI index, which is measured in the vertical axis, okay? The vertical axis is the proposed ASTI index measure. And the horizontal axis is the traditional intensity ratio. So if you compare the countries there based on the traditional intensity ratio, you compare countries from right to left, right? So the intensity ratio will tell you that the US there is all relative to the US. The US with a value of 1 is the country with the highest intensity ratio, right? And so that's what we have. Look at India, how far from the right is according to the intensity ratio. And that's what we were seeing in the first picture that I showed you. The same for China, well, Kenya, well, all of these countries are underperforming in terms of intensity if you use the traditional intensity index. The picture changes completely when you start using the ASTI index because now the ranking goes from up to down in the figure. So as you can see there, if we use this index, then US, Brazil, Kenya, China are investing at the same intensity level. And India is not far from there. It's very close to that. And so this index is giving us, some idea of at least what we expected when we started analyzing the intensity ratio. So, for instance, in the case of Africa, you have Kenya as the country with the highest intensity, and similar, the same intensity as the US, but it's important to understand what that means. Relative to Kenya's characteristics. That means that no country similar to Kenya is investing more in R&D than Kenya. That's what it means. It's not that Kenya is best, as system is as good as the US. It means that there's no country similar to Kenya that is investing more than Kenya. And then, as I showed you before, we can, using this index, we can calculate the intensity gap, that is the investment that countries need to make to reach the frontier, to close that gap that I showed you before. And as you can see there, the gap, developing countries is the black thicker line there. The gap has been closing in recent years. So the gap is reducing. Developing countries have been increasing investment. As you can see there at the top, also sub-Saharan Africa is, the gap in sub-Saharan Africa is clearly decreasing. So the investment in recent years have resulted in higher intensity in these countries. Asia is the region with the lowest gap, that is the region that is investing more intensively in R&D. And Latin America, on the other hand, is the biggest contributor to the gap. So conclusions, well, the advice would be do not use the intensity ratio for country comparisons or use it with caution. The goal of reaching 1% depends on the country, depends on several things. Most Latin American countries already reached. Asian countries will probably have a very, very difficult time to get there, and they probably shouldn't get there. That's the most important thing, because there's no point, it doesn't mean anything.